The moment I hired a licensed surveyor, my neighbor walked across the street laughing so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. "You're wasting your money," he shouted loud enough for everyone on the block to hear. "That fence has been there for 20 years. Everyone knows it's my land." A few neighbors nodded. Some even smiled at me with sympathy, as if I'd already lost. I didn't argue. I simply watched the survey crew unload their equipment. The surveyor planted his first marker, checked an old county map, frowned, then measured everything again. Suddenly, the smile disappeared from his face. He looked directly at my neighbor and quietly said, "Sir, you may want to stop talking." The entire street fell silent. My neighbor laughed one last time, until the surveyor placed a bright orange stake almost 12 feet inside what he had proudly called his backyard. His face drained of color, because that single marker didn't just prove his fence was in the wrong place. It exposed years of lies, thousands of dollars in stolen property, and one mistake that would soon cost him far more than he ever imagined. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 35 years old, and after nearly 15 years of working as a commercial electrician across Illinois, I finally bought the home I dreamed about for most of my adult life. It wasn't a mansion or a luxury estate, just a quiet 3-bedroom house on a peaceful suburban street with a decent-sized backyard and enough space to build the woodworking workshop I'd always wanted. The neighborhood looked friendly when I moved in. Kids rode bicycles after school, neighbors waved while walking their dogs, and weekends were usually filled with lawnmowers and backyard barbecues. It felt like exactly the kind of place where people respected one another. That impression lasted about 3 days. The man living next door introduced himself as Victor Hansen. He looked to be in his late 50s, carried himself with absolute confidence, and acted less like a homeowner than the unofficial mayor of the neighborhood. During our first conversation, he spent 20 minutes explaining how everyone on the street eventually came to him for advice because he'd lived there for over 20 years. At first, I figured he was simply proud of the neighborhood. Then the little things started happening. His pickup truck regularly sat so close to my driveway that backing out became difficult. Landscaping stones mysteriously appeared several feet beyond the fence separating our yards. Every time I worked outside, Victor somehow wandered over to explain how previous owners had always done things his way. One Saturday morning, I mentioned that I planned to build a workshop behind my house. Since the permit office recommended confirming property boundaries first, I'd already scheduled a licensed land surveyor. Victor burst into laughter. "You actually paid for a survey?" he shouted loudly enough for several neighbors watering their lawns to hear. I nodded. He slapped the wooden fence beside him. "Son, you just wasted your money. That fence has been right there for over 20 years. Everybody knows exactly where the property line is." A couple of neighbors exchanged uncertain smiles but stayed quiet. I simply answered, "I'd rather know than assume." He laughed even harder. "You're about to pay somebody thousands of dollars to tell you what I can tell you for free." I smiled politely and ended the conversation. 3 mornings later, a white survey truck rolled slowly onto my driveway. 2 crew members stepped out carrying tripods, GPS equipment, and bright orange survey stakes. Victor walked outside almost immediately with a coffee mug in one hand. He looked at the crew, then looked at me, and shook his head with a grin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced loudly enough for half the street to hear, "you're about to watch this poor guy waste the easiest money a surveyor's ever made." The crew never responded. Neither did I. The neighborhood seemed unusually quiet after Victor's little performance. People who normally stayed inside on weekday mornings suddenly found reasons to check their mail, trim bushes, or walk their dogs. Everyone wanted to see whether the survey would prove anything or simply confirm what Victor had been bragging about for years. The lead surveyor introduced himself as Daniel Brooks, a licensed professional land surveyor with nearly 25 years of experience. Calm, polite, and completely unfazed by Victor's comments, he shook my hand before unloading several cases from the truck. "We'll start by locating the original subdivision monuments," he explained. "Everything else is measured from those." Within minutes, his crew had a robotic total station mounted on a tripod, while another technician carried a GPS receiver toward the corner of my property. They weren't measuring the fence at all. They were looking for something much older. Victor leaned comfortably against his fence with crossed arms. "I could have saved you all this trouble," he called out. "That fence is the property line. Has been since before you bought the place." Daniel looked up briefly. "Maybe," he answered politely. "Maybe not." Then he returned to his work without another word. For nearly an hour, the crew moved carefully around both front yards, checking buried monument caps, comparing measurements, and entering numbers into handheld tablets. Everything appeared routine. Then I noticed Daniel stop walking. He looked down at the screen in his controller, frowned slightly, and measured the same point again. He said nothing. A few minutes later, he called one of his assistants over. "Run that line again from the northeast monument." The younger technician repeated the measurement. Daniel studied the new numbers. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough that I realized something wasn't matching. Instead of placing the next survey stake, he walked back to the truck and opened a long metal storage drawer. From inside, he removed several folded county plat maps and a binder filled with property records. Victor chuckled loudly. "See? He's already confused." Daniel ignored him completely. For almost 20 minutes, he compared old subdivision plats with digital county records before returning to the instruments. This time he personally operated the equipment. He checked one corner, then another, then repeated every measurement from an entirely different reference point. Finally, he looked toward his assistant and spoke quietly, though I was close enough to hear. "Don't place any boundary stakes yet." The assistant looked surprised. "You think the monument's wrong?" Daniel slowly shook his head. "No." He glanced toward Victor's fence before looking back at the map. "I think the fence is." Nobody spoke after Daniel's last sentence. Even though he had said it quietly, something about his tone carried enough certainty to erase the casual smiles from everyone watching. Victor straightened away from the fence. "What was that supposed to mean?" he demanded. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward the sidewalk where one of the original iron survey monuments had been uncovered earlier that morning. He carefully leveled the total station one final time, checked the digital coordinates, and nodded to his assistant. "Ready." The younger technician picked up a bright orange fiberglass survey stake and waited. Daniel studied the screen for several seconds. 31 feet 4 inches. The assistant walked forward. Another 8 inches. He adjusted. "Stop." The stake was positioned several feet away from the existing fence. Daniel picked up a rubber mallet and drove the orange marker firmly into the ground. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The sound echoed across the quiet street. Victor laughed. "Congratulations," he said sarcastically. "You just marked the wrong place." Daniel calmly walked over carrying a roll of fluorescent ribbon. He tied it to the stake before turning toward both of us. "This marker represents the legal property corner based on the original subdivision monuments and current county records." Victor waved dismissively. "Impossible." Daniel remained completely calm. "We verified it 3 separate ways." "Then verify it again." "We already did." Victor stepped closer until he was standing beside the orange stake. "You're telling me this little stick is the property line?" "I'm telling you," Daniel replied, "that this point is legally recognized by every recorded document we've checked." Victor pointed toward the wooden fence. "That fence has been there for more than 20 years. Daniel nodded. "I don't doubt that. And everyone knows it's the boundary. I understand that's what people believed." Victor folded his arms confidently. "So your survey is wrong." Daniel opened the county plat map and laid it across the hood of his truck. "No, sir." He pointed to the legal description, then to the digital measurements displayed on his controller. The original subdivision monuments, the recorded plat, the deed descriptions, and our GPS observations all match. He paused before looking directly at Victor. They all place the boundary approximately 11 feet and 8 inches beyond your current fence. For a moment, nobody reacted. The word seemed almost too unbelievable to process. One elderly neighbor quietly whispered, 11 feet? Another man removed his sunglasses and stared toward the fence in disbelief. Victor's confident smile slowly disappeared. His eyes shifted from the orange stake to Daniel's maps, then back toward the fence he'd spent years insisting proved he was right. The color drained from his face. For the first time since I'd moved into the neighborhood, My neighbor had absolutely nothing to say. Victor finally found his voice. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "That fence has been standing longer than you've probably been alive. You're telling me everybody else was wrong?" Daniel never raised his voice. "I'm telling you what the legal records show." He walked back to his truck and unfolded several large plat maps across the tailgate. Curious neighbors slowly gathered closer, careful not to touch anything. "If anyone wants to understand why we reached this conclusion," Daniel said calmly, "I'll explain." He pointed to a faded subdivision plat recorded nearly 30 years earlier. "This is the original map filed with the county when these lots were created. Every property line begins from permanent survey monuments installed before any homes were built." His finger traced several straight lines across the drawing. "We located every surviving monument this morning. Their positions match the county coordinates almost perfectly." Victor folded his arms. "Maps can be wrong." Daniel nodded. "Sometimes they can. That's why we never rely on only one source." He lifted another folder. "These are the recorded deed descriptions for both properties." Then another. "These are historical county survey records." Finally, he held up his electronic controller. "And these are today's GPS observations tied to the same legal reference system." He looked around at everyone watching. Every independent source agrees. Silence settled over the group. An older woman named Mrs. Jenkins, who had lived across the street for years, slowly raised her hand. "I always wondered why Victor's fence looked different from everyone else's," she admitted quietly. "It seemed farther over, but I figured there must have been a reason." Another neighbor nodded. "I noticed it too when I replaced my fence a few years ago." Victor turned sharply toward them. "You never said anything." Neither neighbor answered. Daniel carefully rolled the maps back together before speaking again. "I can't tell you who built this fence or why it ended up here. That's outside my job." He paused. "My responsibility is simply to identify the legal boundary." I looked across what I'd believed was Victor's backyard. Now I could clearly imagine where the actual property line ran. Nearly 12 feet of grass, part of the decorative landscaping, a row of mature shrubs, even the corner of a small retaining wall. All appeared to extend onto my property. Daniel glanced at me. "I recommend photographing everything before anyone moves a single object." I nodded and pulled out my phone. Victor stared silently across the yard. The confidence he'd shown all morning had completely disappeared. For the first time, even he seemed to realize this wasn't just an embarrassing mistake. It was becoming a very expensive one. For a few long seconds, Victor simply stood there staring at the orange survey stake. Then something inside him seemed to snap. "This whole thing is garbage," he shouted, loud enough for people halfway down the block to hear. "You people think you're going to walk in here with fancy equipment and steal my property?" Daniel remained perfectly composed. "No one is taking anything from you, sir. We're identifying the legal boundary based on recorded documents." Victor jabbed a finger toward him. "I've lived here 22 years. I know where my property ends." Daniel answered calmly. "And the county records show something different." Victor turned toward me. "You planned this." I blinked. "Planned what?" "You hired him because you wanted part of my yard." "I hired a surveyor because I wanted to build a workshop." He laughed bitterly. "Sure you did." Several neighbors exchanged uncomfortable glances but stayed silent. I wasn't interested in arguing. "I didn't move the boundary," I said. "The survey simply located it." Victor shook his head. "I'm not accepting this." Daniel handed him a business card. "You have every right to obtain an independent survey if you disagree with our findings." Victor grabbed the card without looking at it. "I'll do a lot more than that." His voice grew louder with every sentence. "I'm calling my attorney. I'm filing complaints against your company. I'll have your license reviewed. And when this fake survey gets thrown out, both of you will be paying for it." Daniel didn't react. "You're entitled to seek legal advice." "I will. And if another licensed survey reaches a different conclusion, the records can be compared." Victor smiled again, though this time it looked forced. "They will reach a different conclusion." Daniel simply nodded. "I'll be interested to see the results." That answer only seemed to frustrate Victor even more. He wanted an argument. Instead, he kept running into calm professionalism. As the survey crew packed away their equipment, Daniel handed me a folder containing the preliminary field notes and explained that the certified survey would be completed within a few days. Keep copies of everything, he advised quietly. I will. And until this is resolved, don't move the fence or touch anything on the disputed area. I understand. After the trucks drove away, the crowd slowly disappeared. Victor remained standing beside his fence with his arms crossed, watching me without saying another word. The confidence he'd shown that morning was gone, but pride had taken its place. As I unlocked my front door, I had the unmistakable feeling that discovering the true property line hadn't ended the conflict. It had only revealed how far Victor was willing to go rather than admit he might have been wrong. 3 days later, Daniel called just after breakfast. Your certified survey is finished, he said. I'd also like to walk the property with you one more time. We noticed a few things during our final review. His tone was calm, but something about it caught my attention. An hour later, the survey crew returned. This time they carried measuring wheels, cameras, and stacks of paperwork instead of the larger equipment they'd used before. Victor watched from his porch, but didn't come over. Daniel handed me the completed survey. Every boundary, measurement, monument, and reference point had been professionally documented. Then he pointed toward the disputed section of the yard. Let's start here. We followed the newly marked property line together. At first, all I noticed was the fence. Then Daniel stopped beside a decorative retaining wall built from large stone blocks. He measured carefully before making a note. This wall crosses the property line by nearly 4 feet. I looked closer. It wasn't just the wall. The flower beds behind it had been built around the same misplaced boundary. A row of expensive, evergreen shrubs stood entirely on my property. Daniel continued walking. 20 feet farther down, he stopped again. The underground irrigation valve is here. He checked another map. The irrigation line also extends across your property. I hadn't even realized there was a sprinkler system. Neither had I expected it to become part of the dispute. As we reached the back corner, Daniel frowned once more. There it is. What? He pointed toward a small wooden storage shed sitting behind Victor's garage. Only one corner crossed the boundary. But according to his measurements, that corner extended almost 30 inches onto my land. I let out a slow breath. So it wasn't only the fence. Daniel shook his head. No. He looked down the entire line. When a fence is placed incorrectly, people naturally build around it. Landscaping, utilities, retaining walls, even accessory structures begin following the wrong reference. Everything slowly started making sense. For years, every improvement had been based on a mistake nobody questioned. Daniel photographed each encroachment from multiple angles before recording the exact measurements. Documentation matters, he explained. If attorneys or insurance companies become involved later, today's records establish the condition before any changes are made. I appreciated how methodical he was. Nothing felt emotional. Nothing felt personal. It was simply facts. As we finished, Daniel closed his notebook. I'm afraid this situation is larger than a boundary disagreement. I looked across the yard one more time. Nearly everything Victor had proudly maintained for years had been built on land that legally wasn't his. And somehow, I had the feeling we'd only uncovered the beginning of the problem. By the following Monday, I realized this had gone far beyond a disagreement between neighbors. I wasn't interested in arguments across the fence or shouting matches in the street. I wanted to handle everything the right way. After a recommendation from a coworker, I scheduled a meeting with Melissa Grant, a real estate attorney who had spent more than 20 years handling property boundary and land use disputes. Her office overlooked the county courthouse. When I arrived, carrying Daniel's survey, photographs, and the property records, she greeted me with a firm handshake before motioning toward the conference table. Let's see what we've got. For nearly 40 minutes, she reviewed every document without interruption. She studied the certified survey first, then the county plat, then the photographs showing the fence, retaining wall, shrubs, irrigation equipment, and the corner of the storage shed extending across the marked boundary. Occasionally, she made small notes in the margin of a legal pad. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. Your survey appears thorough. That's good to hear. It was completed by a licensed surveyor, references original subdivision monuments, and matches the recorded legal descriptions. She closed the folder. From what I see, you've done exactly what a responsible property owner should do. I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. So what happens now? Melissa folded her hands. The worst thing you can do is get into personal arguments with your neighbor. I wasn't planning to. Good. She slid a blank notepad toward me. From this point forward, every conversation should be calm, documented, and preferably in writing. She explained that emotions often made simple property disputes far more complicated than necessary. If he threatens you, she said, don't respond emotionally. If he insults me, don't respond. If he demands I move the survey stakes, don't touch them. Her advice was surprisingly simple. Let the documents do the talking. She recommended sending a formal written notice requesting removal of every encroachment identified in the certified survey while allowing reasonable time for a response. If he refuses, then we'll evaluate the next legal step. Before I left, Melissa handed every document back in perfect order. You already have the strongest thing anyone can bring into a boundary dispute. The survey. She smiled. No. She tapped the organized folder. Patience. Driving home, I realized she was right. Victor won an emotional fight. The law, however, cared very little about pride. It cared about evidence. And for the first time since this all began, I felt completely confident that I had exactly that. 2 days after meeting with Melissa, the formal notice was ready. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't threatening. It simply stated the facts. Attached to the letter were copies of the certified survey, photographs of every documented encroachment, and a request that all structures extending onto my property be removed within 30 days. Melissa had written every sentence carefully, leaving no room for misunderstanding. We're giving him a reasonable opportunity to resolve this voluntarily, she had explained. That's all the court ever expects at this stage. The letter was sent by certified mail. According to the tracking information, it arrived the following Thursday, just after noon. I didn't have to wonder when Victor received it. I heard him. His front door slammed so hard that several birds flew from a nearby maple tree. A moment later, he stormed down his driveway, holding the large certified envelope in one hand. What is this? He yelled. I was watering the flower beds near my porch. It's the formal notice my attorney mentioned. You hired a lawyer? I did. Victor ripped open the envelope before reaching the sidewalk. Pages scattered into the breeze. He caught them angrily and skimmed the first paragraph. His face turned bright red. You actually expect me to tear down my fence? The letter asks you to remove every encroachment identified in the survey. He laughed loudly. This isn't happening. Several neighbors looked outside after hearing the commotion. Victor pointed the crumpled paperwork toward my house. You're trying to steal land that's been mine for decades. I kept my voice steady. I'm asking for my legal property. He shook the papers again. My attorney will bury you. You have every right to speak with one. His jaw tightened. You think these papers scare me? No, they should. I don't expect them to. That answer seemed to frustrate him even more. He wanted an argument. Instead, he found someone unwilling to give him one. After another minute of shouting, Victor stuffed the documents back into the envelope and marched toward his house. Before going inside, he turned around one last time. I'm not moving a single board. Then he slammed the front door behind him. The street became quiet again. Mrs. Jenkins slowly walked over from across the road. I've lived here almost 30 years, she said softly. I've never seen Victor this angry. I folded the garden hose neatly beside the porch. I don't think he's angry because of the letter. She looked toward Victor's house. You think he's worried? I nodded. For the first time, he knows this isn't about opinions anymore. It was about documents, deadlines, and the truth that was becoming harder to ignore. The 30-day deadline came and went. Nothing changed. The fence stayed exactly where it was. The retaining wall remained untouched. The shrubs were still neatly trimmed, and the storage shed hadn't moved an inch. Victor was making a statement, or at least he thought he was. The following Monday morning, I heard the sound of another truck pulling onto the street. I looked out my front window. A white pickup with another surveying company's logo slowly parked in front of Victor's house. Two technicians climbed out carrying tripods and equipment cases. A few minutes later, a man wearing a reflective safety vest walked over to Victor, who immediately began pointing toward my yard with exaggerated gestures. Mrs. Jenkins noticed them too. She walked over while I was getting my mail. Looks like he hired his own surveyor. I expected he would. You seem awfully calm. I smiled. If their measurements are based on the same legal records, they'll end up in the same place. Across the street, Victor glanced toward my house and smirked. He wanted me to watch. He wanted everyone to watch. This was supposed to be the moment his surveyor proved mine wrong. I simply waved politely before returning to my porch. For the next several hours, the new survey crew worked methodically around both properties. From a distance, I noticed something interesting. They weren't measuring my fence. They were doing exactly what Daniel's crew had done, finding the original subdivision monuments, checking reference markers, comparing coordinates, repeating measurements from different directions. Professional surveyors, I realized, all followed the same process because the property records, not personal opinions, determined the answers. Late that afternoon, I stepped outside to collect a package. The lead surveyor was standing beside the same orange survey stake Daniel had installed days earlier. He studied his electronic controller for several seconds before calling one of his assistants over. Together, they repeated the measurement. Then they checked it again. Victor stood nearby with his arms folded confidently. He kept smiling, but I noticed something else. Neither surveyor looked confused. Neither appeared to be searching for a different boundary. Instead, they continued confirming the existing one. For the first time all week, Victor's confident smile began to fade. Even from across the street, I could tell the answer he was expecting wasn't the one his own survey crew was finding. By the next morning, nearly everyone on our block knew Victor's survey crew had returned. Curtains shifted, garage doors opened. People suddenly found reasons to sweep their driveways or water perfectly healthy lawns. Nobody said it aloud, but everyone was waiting for one question to be answered. Would the second survey prove Victor right? Just before 10 o'clock, the lead surveyor walked slowly toward Victor, carrying a clipboard. I couldn't hear their conversation from my porch, but I could see every expression. Victor started speaking first, confident, animated, pointing repeatedly toward my yard. The surveyor listened patiently, without interrupting. Then he unfolded a copy of the recorded subdivision plat and laid it across the hood of his truck. He pointed to several measurements before turning his electronic controller so Victor could see the display. Victor leaned closer. The surveyor explained something calmly. Victor immediately shook his head. The surveyor measured again. Then he walked over to the original monument marker, verified its location, and repeated the entire process a second time. A few minutes later, another technician joined them. The two surveyors compared their readings, reviewed the county coordinates, and quietly nodded to each other. That was all I needed to see. Professional confirmation didn't require dramatic speeches. It required matching evidence. Finally, the lead surveyor removed his hard hat and spoke to Victor for nearly 5 uninterrupted minutes. Victor didn't interrupt once. His shoulders slowly lowered. His crossed arms relaxed. The confidence that had carried him through every argument simply disappeared. As the surveyor packed away his equipment, he noticed me standing near my mailbox. He walked over. I assume you've already had a survey completed. I have. He nodded respectfully. I reviewed their work this morning. And he smiled politely. I would have signed my name to the exact same boundary. I thanked him for his honesty. There isn't really another professional opinion here, he continued. When licensed surveys begin from the same legal monuments and recorded deeds, they should reach the same conclusion. Across the street, Victor remained motionless beside his driveway. For several minutes, he simply stared at the fence. Not angrily, not proudly, just silently. The survey crew loaded the last tripod into their truck before driving away. No celebration, no dramatic announcement, only facts. Mrs. Jenkins walked over carrying her newspaper. So, I looked toward Victor's yard one last time. He hired another survey hoping to prove the first one wrong. And instead, I smiled faintly. He ended up paying someone else to tell him exactly the same thing. Victor never looked in my direction, for the first time since this all began. Even he knew the argument was over. After Victor's own survey confirmed the original boundary, I expected things to move quickly. They didn't. Instead, the next few weeks became a slow process of inspections, estimates, and documentation. Melissa explained that once an encroachment is confirmed, every affected improvement has to be evaluated individually. It isn't only about the fence anymore, she reminded me. She was right. A contractor hired to estimate the fence relocation measured every section carefully before shaking his head. Moving the fence is the easy part, he said. The retaining wall is another story. A landscaping company arrived 2 days later. They identified irrigation pipes running beneath the shrubs that crossed the legal property line. Relocating them would require digging through several sections of the yard without damaging nearby utility lines. Then came the storage shed. A structural contractor inspected its foundation before explaining that even though only one corner crossed the boundary, the entire building would need to be lifted and repositioned. Victor stood nearby during every inspection. He rarely spoke anymore. When he did, his voice lacked the certainty it once carried. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But every estimate reminded me that none of this had happened overnight. Each flower bed, each section of retaining wall, every sprinkler line, every improvement had been built after someone assumed the fence marked the correct boundary. Years of small decisions had quietly multiplied one mistake into an expensive chain of problems. One afternoon, Mrs. Jenkins walked over while another contractor loaded equipment into his truck. "I've been thinking about this whole situation," she admitted. "So have I. You know what surprises me?" "What?" "Not that the fence was wrong." She looked toward Victor's yard. "It's how many other things followed it." I nodded. Once people trust the first mistake, every decision after that feels perfectly reasonable. She smiled sadly. "I suppose that's true in more than property disputes." That sentence stayed with me. By the end of the week, Melissa had organized every inspection report into a single file. The stack of documents was nearly 2 inches thick. Looking through it, I realized the biggest cost wasn't going to be replacing a fence. It was correcting years of assumptions that had never been questioned. Sometimes the most expensive mistakes aren't made in a single day. They're built one small decision at a time, until the truth finally catches up with them. The work began on a cool Monday morning. Just after 8 o'clock, 2 contractor trucks pulled onto the street, followed by a flatbed carrying stacks of new fencing materials. For the first time since this whole dispute had started, there were no arguments waiting outside. Victor stood quietly in his driveway, hands in his pockets. The construction supervisor introduced himself, reviewed the certified survey once more, and walked the entire property with his crew before giving a simple instruction. "Start with the north corner." Power drills hummed to life. Within minutes, workers began removing the first fence panels. The weathered boards that had stood in the wrong place for years came apart surprisingly fast. One section after another disappeared. As each post was pulled from the ground, the true width of my backyard slowly began to appear. It felt strange. I had lived there for months, believing the property ended at the old fence. Now, every section that came down revealed land I legally owned but had never really seen. The retaining wall required far more effort. Stone by stone, the crew carefully dismantled it without damaging the surrounding landscaping. Another team disconnected the irrigation lines before rerouting them entirely onto Victor's property. Even the corner of the storage shed had to be lifted with hydraulic jacks, while contractors repositioned its foundation according to the survey stakes. Everything was done professionally. Nobody celebrated. Nobody mocked anyone. The work was simply correcting what the documents had already proven. Several neighbors quietly watched from their porches throughout the day. Mrs. Jenkins walked over during lunch and smiled. "It looks different already." "It does. Bigger." I laughed softly. It always was. By late afternoon, the final fence post had been installed along the correct property line. The bright orange survey stakes that had started the entire dispute were finally removed. They had served their purpose. The supervisor compared every completed section against the certified survey before shaking my hand. Everything matches. I thanked the entire crew before watching them drive away. The street became quiet once again. Victor remained outside for several minutes, staring at the newly positioned fence. He didn't complain. He didn't argue. He simply nodded once before walking back toward his house. Standing in my backyard, I looked across the newly restored property. There was no feeling of victory, only relief. The argument that had consumed weeks of tension had finally been replaced by something far more satisfying. Certainty, because once the truth had been measured, documented, and properly restored, there was nothing left to debate. The weeks following the fence relocation felt surprisingly peaceful. For the first time since I'd moved into the neighborhood, I could enjoy my morning coffee on the back patio without wondering whether another argument was about to begin. The street itself seemed different. Not physically, just quieter. Victor no longer spent hours standing beside the fence, offering unsolicited advice to everyone walking past his house. The loud confidence that had once defined him had simply faded away. He still maintained his yard. He still waved politely when someone greeted him. But the man who had laughed at the survey crew in front of the entire neighborhood was gone. One Saturday morning, I noticed something unexpected. A survey truck pulled into the driveway across the street. Then another one arrived 2 houses farther down later that week. Mrs. Jenkins smiled when she caught me looking. "Seems you're starting a trend." I laughed. "I don't think people suddenly became interested in property lines." "No," she agreed. "I think they became interested in certainty." She wasn't wrong. Word had spread through the neighborhood about what had happened. Nobody talked about it with excitement anymore. Instead, people discussed it almost like a lesson. One homeowner admitted he'd never actually looked at his property's legal survey after buying the house. Another confessed he'd always assumed his fence followed the lot line because the previous owner had told him so. Now, they wanted proof instead of assumptions. Even a neighborhood association mentioned the importance of keeping property records organized during its monthly meeting. Listening to those conversations made me realize something. This dispute had never really been about winning. It had reminded everyone that confidence wasn't the same thing as accuracy. Facts didn't become less true simply because someone repeated an opinion for 20 years. One evening, as I finished organizing tools inside my workshop, I looked through the open garage door and noticed Victor mowing his lawn. When he reached the new fence, he slowed down, carefully turned the mower, and stayed completely on his own side. It was such a small moment that most people would have ignored it. I didn't, because that single quiet decision said more than weeks of arguments ever had. Respect had finally replaced assumption, not because anyone forced it, but because the evidence had left no room for anything else. Sometimes an entire neighborhood changes, not after a dramatic confrontation, but after one undeniable fact reminds everyone where the truth actually begins. Almost 3 weeks passed without a single conversation between Victor and me. We saw each other often enough. A quick nod while collecting the mail. A polite wave when pulling into our driveways. Nothing more. Then, one Saturday afternoon, I was sanding the final trim pieces for my workshop when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around. Victor stood a few feet away with both hands in his jacket pockets. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked toward the new fence before clearing his throat. "Got a minute?" "Sure." He nodded toward the workshop. "It's coming along. Almost finished." Another long silence followed. The old Victor would have filled it with opinions. This version seemed to choose his words carefully. "I've been thinking about everything that happened." I waited. I was convinced that fence was right. "I know. My father always told me it marked the property line." He looked down at the ground. I never questioned it. I understood what he meant. When something's been there long enough, I said, it starts feeling like a fact. He gave a small, tired smile. Guess I confused familiar with correct. Neither of us laughed. There wasn't anything funny about weeks of stress, contractors, attorneys, and construction crews. Victor took a slow breath. I should have listened when the first survey came back. I appreciated the honesty. It probably would have saved both of us a lot of time. And money. I nodded. Probably. He looked across the yard where the new fence now stood exactly where the survey had placed it. You know, he said quietly, when I laughed at you for hiring that surveyor. He stopped. I wasn't trying to embarrass you. It felt that way. I know. Another pause settled between us. I'm sorry. The words were simple. There was no long explanation. No attempt to blame anyone else. Just two words spoken honestly. I looked at him for a moment before answering. I appreciate you saying that. He extended his hand. I shook it. Not because everything that had happened was suddenly forgotten, but because holding on to bitterness wouldn't improve either of our lives. Victor started walking back toward his house before stopping halfway. Without turning around, he spoke one final sentence. I spent years defending a fence. He glanced briefly over his shoulder. I should have spent 5 minutes checking where it actually belonged. Then he continued home. I watched him disappear inside before returning to the workshop. Sometimes the strongest ending to a long dispute isn't winning an argument. It's finally hearing the truth from the person who spent the longest trying to deny it. By the end of autumn, my workshop was finally complete. Nothing extravagant, just a clean, well-organized space with sturdy workbenches, good lighting, and enough room to spend quiet weekends building furniture, repairing tools, and enjoying a hobby I'd postponed for far too many years. Sometimes I'd open the large garage door and simply stand there looking across the backyard. The new fence blended into the landscape so naturally that it was hard to remember it had ever stood anywhere else. Visitors who came by never knew there had once been a dispute over the property line. To them, everything looked exactly as it should. Maybe that was the best outcome.
Life had returned to normal. Victor and I remained neighbors. We weren't close friends, but we treated each other with courtesy and respect. That was enough. Every now and then I'd notice him measuring carefully before planting something or checking paperwork before starting a new project. I smiled whenever I saw it. Not because he had been wrong, because he had learned. Truth has a way of changing people when they're willing to accept it. One afternoon, while organizing lumber inside the workshop, I found the original certified survey folded neatly inside a filing cabinet. For a moment, I considered throwing it away. After all, the fence had been moved. The disagreement was over. Then I carefully placed it back into the folder. Not as a reminder of conflict. As a reminder of why facts matter. Looking back, hiring a licensed surveyor was never about proving my neighbor wrong. It wasn't about embarrassing anyone or winning an argument. It was about making an important decision based on verified information instead of assumptions. That one choice protected my property, prevented future disputes, and ultimately restored peace to the neighborhood. People sometimes ask whether the survey was worth the money. I always give the same answer. The survey didn't create the problem. It revealed one that had been hidden for years. Ignoring it wouldn't have changed the truth. It only would have delayed it. As the sun began setting behind the trees, I switched off the workshop lights and locked the door. The backyard was quiet. The fence stood exactly where it belonged. The neighborhood felt peaceful once again. And every time I looked at those straight fence lines, I remembered one simple lesson that reached far beyond property boundaries. Never let confidence replace evidence. Because sometimes the smallest marker driven into the ground uncovers the biggest truth of all, and once the truth is measured, accepting it is always easier than living with the cost of denying it.